Welcome back to 20 Minutes of Science so that you don't need a PhD. Today we will be hearing from Claudia Zeppetelli, a PhD student of sports psychology at McGill University. Claudia, thanks so much for joining us. And I feel like for me personally, this conversation is very timely because I work with a lot of younger athletes, and I recently was in a conversation about careers in sports with someone that I work with. And he had asked, sports psychology, what is this? And I think if I'm remembering right, he said something along the lines of, is this like where you help people when they're nervous before their games? And I was like, yeah, you know what? I think that's approximately it. But at the time I didn't have a super articulate definition. So I'm excited to ask you, when you get that question outside of research, from family or friends, and you don't have time to give them the full rundown of everything you do and everything you've read about, what is it that you research as a PhD student of sports psychology?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think sports psychology is so broad, but specific to my area, my elevator pitch is basically I look into elite women's sport, specifically elite female athletes and elite women coaches. And I want to learn more about their experiences in elite sport, professional sport, Olympics, basically any high performance environment, and specifically looking at their experiences of mental health and well-being. And so as you probably can imagine, that's very broad still, but given we're still conceptualizing my research area, we wanted to keep it broad. And so it can involve things like coach-athlete relationship, it can involve things like barriers, it can involve things like mental health. So yeah, that's just my general research area.
That's super interesting. And I think what you said here, first off, it's a whole lot more than just helping people when they're nervous. So I'll have to link this recording to that athlete when this comes up in the future. But I think your path here is something that would interest a lot of people. So with this interest that you've presented that as it sits is currently very broad, which I think is awesome, was there anything in your life, whether within sports or outside of it, that sort of led you to say, you know what, this is important and I want to dedicate myself to walking this path and to potentially helping people with these things? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think this is sort of the story I tell everybody because just given, again, like I did my undergrad in kin, so I had a bit more of like that's exercise science or like sports science background. And sports psychology kind of came in later in my degree. So I wasn't really exposed to it right away. And so it was really through my actual sport experience where I kind of started thinking like maybe there's more to sport than just, the field of play and like the X's and O's. And it was based in an experience that I had with an old coach when I was playing competitive soccer. And for whatever reason, like we really didn't get along. And I was a player that just wanted to be perfect and really live up to his expectations. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get that from him. And I was a bit of a younger player. And like, I think looking back, like some really fundamental things were lacking in that relationship between him and I, and things just like communication and like openness and confidence, like things that are very sports psychology. And so that when I ended up taking the undergrad class in sports psychology, they were talking about the coach-athlete relationship. And I said, I resonated so much with it because that was something that I really struggled with, like nearing the end of like my competitive soccer career. And yeah, so that was the thing that piqued my interest first. And then I guess the other thing was just that at the time, I kind of just thought like, that's just how it is. Like the mentality of sport is just like, it's going to be tough, but that's just how it is. Like you're going to learn to like face adversity and things like that. But then, to what extent? And that's where I think some of like the psychological pieces come in. So those were, I think, the two things that really piqued my interest in the field.
So much to unpack there. I love so many of the points that you made. And honestly, I think this is so admirable because you're telling this story and I'm sitting here like feeling the need to say, oh, I'm sorry that this happened, because truly that sounds so difficult. But at the same time, I'm like, well, it's almost good, dare I say, that this happened, because you took this and used it as a launch pad to enter into this field as a researcher where, you have so much reach to help so many others who might be in similar shoes to where you stood during that more negative experience. And correct me if I'm wrong, you're doing research, and are you also coaching at this point in some capacity?
So I'm not coaching like a sport as like a coach or an assistant coach, but I do work with some teams as like a mental performance consultant or a mental performance coach. So
Oh,
again,
interesting.
taking those like sports psychology skills and like integrating it into their development plans and like just teaching them about mental performance and mental skills.
I think that's amazing. Do you work with any particular sports currently, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. I'm pretty open. I do like team sports just because I have a background playing team sports. So I just resonate with a bit more of those intricacies in team sports that I might not get in individual sports. But, I've worked with ringette, I've worked with hockey, I've worked with soccer. And I assume that diversity is just going to continue. So yeah, so far those three.
That's awesome. And drawing from my own experience here only, so correct me if any of this is inaccurate from your own, but I have seen this as a real problem in my domain, which is in football. I grew up playing football, and now I do a lot of coaching for younger football athletes. And it seems that despite the fact that so many athletes, young and old, do feel these problems, like people know they're nervous. They know that sometimes when things go wrong, they struggle to move past it. They know there's these relationship issues that you've identified sometimes between teammates and between athletes and coaches. Yet, at least in my experience, I've seen that there's almost this like rejection of anything. Like we will put unlimited time into the weight room or into speed work or studying film or even nutrition or whatever it might be. But as soon as it's like, hey, I have a sports psychology tool for you, it's like people don't want to invest in that. Is this something that you've observed in the consultant roles that you've had?
I think I know it exists in my own experience, which I think this just shows a bit of that shift. I've been sought out by different teams. So it's them reaching out to me. So they have to A, be aware that I provide services in mental performance, and B, realize that maybe that could be useful for their team. So just that awareness is huge because they're reaching out to me. They have that interest. They have somewhat of a trust in my credentials. So that in itself is already better than where the field was maybe 5-10 years ago.
It's amazing to hear.
Yeah. And I think some of the, how to put it, pushback comes maybe from some athletes. So I've worked with like a bunch of athletes to date already, and whether it's just like a lack of knowledge or maybe a lack of buy-in, I think some of the topics some people resonate better with and some people resonate less well with. And some people are just more open to talk about performance and maybe performance slumps, things that might be a bit harder to talk about than others. So it just depends on the individual athletes as well. But I will say all the coaches that I work with kind of prioritize the mental side. And so there's been less of that stigma to like not talk about it because they do buy in and they realize that it's important.
I think that's so promising to hear, and maybe something a lot of us who are outside of this bubble of work, we may not be aware of. But with that, you touched on the fact that some individuals who you work with are more difficult than others in opening up to these sort of things. And I know this is the $1,000,000 question that may or may not have any kind of solution, so not meaning to put you on the spot, but have you found in these situations anything of use for breaking down this wall? Basically, for getting people who might not care by nature or might not have a natural interest in these sort of things to snap into that mode of action where they're like, okay, I'm paying attention, I'm applying this, I'm going to see what it does.
Yeah, and I think I have sort of two streams of thought for this and two different contexts. So I've worked with in the past senior high boys or men's soccer. So it's a bit of an age where there's a lot of things going on, like senior high. Everyone's like feeling good. They feel on top of the world. And this team has had success in the past. And I think the context was that the coach wanted them to focus more. That was the main like sort of initial exposure to the team. It's like, yeah, I just think that our players need to focus more and like be in the game and just be dialed in a bit more. I said, okay, sure. Like, let's see what we can do. And I think especially for this age group, and I think this can probably be for a lot of people, no one wants to just sit down for an hour and get lectured on material. So part of my role with this team especially was how to make it important to them. So really drawing the parallels, whether it's through videos of their favorite athletes talking about mental health, or maybe they're talking about a performance slump, or how they use a certain skill. So finding those key like role models that these players may look up to and catch them talking about mental performance, and then making that connection to, well, this is actually this skill and this is how you use it. So just drawing those lines between research as I know it, but making it digestible and really applicable to them. And then I guess similarly to that, I think it's just adapting content to the context. And so again, I've worked with ringette. Hockey, I know how it rolls. Like, I get it. Like, my brother used to play hockey, so I understand how the game works. So it's very easy for me to like draw parallels to when are the high intensity moments, when are the moments when you have a second to think, and really draw on those when I'm giving recommendations to athletes. But something like ringette, I kind of had to learn the rules of the game, and I had to learn, okay, well, when do they get a pause? Do they get a pause? I had to learn that in ringette there's like 4 periods, and like it's this length instead of, so it's very different from hockey, what I was familiar with. But again, like when I'm giving them a recommendation, I want to be informed on the context so that they're not being like, that's not going to work for me because the sport doesn't run that way. And so, yeah, just to summarize, it's just making it digestible to the athletes and then really applying it to their context, I think have been things that have helped me and that have helped them buy in a bit more.
I see. And I think that's so interesting what you've described. It's almost, maybe this is a reach, but it's almost like a language barrier, right? Between, and we think about this a lot in the capsule, and how do we make science something that people who aren't science nerds like us will actually care about, you know? And I think what you've described with adapting to the context and kind of running these things in parallel to existing interests, I think that's incredibly insightful and something that I would like to try to apply myself in those who I work with. So another thing that caught my attention there, kind of a jump in topic, but you had mentioned that you worked with this particular team on focus. And I have no doubt there are listeners right now who are like, hey, I also need to focus more. And I'm one of these people. I'm like, I'd love to be able to focus more. So for your everyday person who has this thought of, I'd like to focus more, you know, whether it's for my sport or for whatever else I'm trying to be productive in, do you have any starting points for where someone would start from it in trying to build up this area of the potential of their brain and their...
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's easy to gravitate to sport because, you know, when you're out on the pitch or on the ice or on wherever you're playing on the court, you really are, especially in the team sport setting, like you're working towards an instrumental objective with your team. And so there's always that in the back of your mind, like whether it's to get a touchdown or to score a goal, like there's always that underlying goal that can keep you grounded if, let's say, you start to lose focus. And then I guess like something that, again, it's kind of like really simple to think, like focusing on the process. Like you hear that all the time, like, oh, just focus on the process, take it day by day. So, but it's so easy to let your mind drift away from that, especially in those high intensity situations of maybe you're down a point, maybe you need that field goal or a touchdown, or maybe you need to score a basket in like the last second of the game. So, but again, just like focusing on, well, what am I going to be able to do? What are the actions that I can take to then lead me to that instrumental goal? And like, it can be as simple as like making the next pass or, you know, resetting the play. Like, it's just those little actions that keep you grounded throughout the process. And in life, that I guess you can transfer that to other aspects of life. Like if you're maybe writing an exam, it's like, well, it's question to question, right? So like, don't think that you have to answer 100 questions, just think you have to answer the next question. Or, you know, just in life, like, I don't know, just like applying it to different spheres is like just focusing on like the next task, because your brain likes to get away and look at the big picture. But at the end of the day, it's like those little tasks that lead up to that overarching goal or the bigger picture, so to speak.
I think that's so well said. And I'm going to have to leave a note for our editors to cut that piece specifically, probably for social media and other things, because so many people need to hear that. Truly. Also, I wondered, because now you are venturing a little bit beyond sports into saying, well, you know, this is how we can apply some of these things to life. And I think that's awesome. And something that we need to probably be doing more of in sports is educating, particularly the youth, on how some of these skills that we learn, especially in the sports psychology realm, these are things that will allow you to succeed in just about anything you want to do. So, and I love the quote, I'll definitely butcher it and I can't remember who said it, but something about you are your own case study, something like that. And I think in science, we do this, right? We learn things, and even if it's not an experiment, we do kind of tend to learn and apply to our daily lives. Is there anything in particular that you have learned, like something that stands out above all else that you've learned and said, okay, I'm going to apply this with my habits and with my actions, and that you've found results from, even as, now you're not on the soccer pitch, but you're a PhD student, which is perhaps at least equally, if not more difficult than the path an athlete walks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think given my experience, I've only worked with athletes who are in school in some capacity while they're in sport. And so a big thing that comes up is time management and like stress management, where there's just a lot of demands going on. And it's without fail something that I talk about every season with multiple athletes. And so at a certain point, you start listening to yourself giving this advice, and you're like, okay, wait, I think I need to look at myself too and make sure that I'm doing my best to optimize my time, but also balancing out my time with, my social life and like other things where I get happiness from. And so just having that balance on like, after a certain hour, like no more screens. I'm just gonna, maybe call my mom or hang out with my friends and read my book or whatever. Just really like purposefully integrating that into your routine, I think is like it's an advice I give to everybody. But I really had to like be disciplined in myself to be like, this is also good for me, because it's really easy to just tell somebody.
I love that. I think helpful reminders for all, aiming to optimize our environment and our headspace and all of these things. So crucial. Whether you're trying to score goals or you're working on a PhD thesis, I think it's almost one and the same. I'm going to be a little bit greedy with the last few minutes here, because I have a burning question that I'm most curious about. And this stems from a poll I ran recently with predominantly high school football players regarding which one is a greater issue for you, or which one's a greater obstacle between you and your goals. Is it that you don't know the steps to take to get there? Or is it that you know the steps, but you don't have the motivation to follow them? And in the real world, of course, it's some amount of a mix, but I asked them to pick which side most closely described them. And the popular choice by far was that people know the steps, or they know where to get the help, but they lack the motivation to do it. So if someone was to come to you, someone you are working with in your consultant role, and had this sort of quandary, what would you use as a starting point to suggest to them to work on unpacking this and moving through this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it's worth noting that like part of the battle is figuring out the steps. And so that's also something that requires like a lot of time and like a lot of thought. And so even that sometimes can be daunting for some athletes to do on their own. So it's sometimes something that we could do collaboratively. But given the example you gave, I think, figuring out, well, what do you mean by motivation? Like, what do you think? Like, how would they describe it themselves? And then maybe depending their answer, it's like, okay, well, given these steps, like maybe if it's like a threat thing, like I don't think I can do it. Okay, well, then we can tease that further apart. Like, what about this is challenging? Is it because it's very long term? Is it because, the first step's the hardest? So there's ways that you can dig into like I don't have motivation, to figure out what that actually means for them. And motivation is just one of those things that it varies so much. Like, I don't think I've seen a single motivational profile that looks the same across any athletes that I've seen.
Interesting.
There's also like, again, like things about motivation where it's like maybe they're reliant on that external reward, and maybe this goal in particular, the external reward's in a year. And so maybe they need to find other ways to get, that feedback, that positive feedback that they're moving forward. So that's like a very brief and like simple answer, but I'd say just having that conversation. I think, you're not always just giving advice to people. You're kind of just also trying to figure out what their thought process is, so you can better serve them and like give them better advice or guidance.
I think that's so helpful to consider. And just to rephrase for my own benefit here to make sure I have this right, you're saying that there's a lot of variability, and perhaps our most valuable early step could be to establish what our unique motivational sticking point is, and to find ways to work with our unique motivational profile, work with it, not against it, as a means of harnessing greater motivation to go out there and get these things done. Is that sort of what you're describing, is leverage your differences?
Yeah, and I'd also say like in that conversation, like just learning about whether like whatever the task is, if it's an objective, and then learning about the person and like what they're feeling in that moment. And yeah, like you said, like establishing that initial contact, like really having that individualized approach with each athlete, because at the end of the day, it's going to be different from person to person. And then, I mean, what also to note, but later on is like really following up as well. So like maybe establish like every 2 weeks, we're going to have a follow up so that they can also touch point with that. Like, you know, they're at least thinking about it every 2 weeks when they meet with you. So.
Very interesting, very informative. As a final question, because I see that we've somehow already exceeded that noted 20-minute allotment, but I think a super valuable question for all would be, you know, for the people that have been hanging on every word and starting to become convinced of, you know what, this is something I probably do need to invest in, either as an athlete or a professional or whatever it might be. Where exactly or how exactly could someone start investing in this area of themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I do think it is hard to get into it when you're not in it. Like, I'm in it, so I have all the resources, I have all the research around me, but I can see how from an external perspective it's not always easy. I guess I'd say start honestly reading and like looking at media, because I think there's instances where people talk about mostly mental health related things, but also things like confidence, performance slumps, motivation, visualization, that these are all sports psychology tools, and people start talking about them more in the media. Like, I know there's that Netflix documentary about Simone Biles as well. She talks a lot about, you know, mental performance, mental health. And so I think there's a bit of a normalization to talk about it now, and just learning different people's experiences can maybe help. You know, if it's an educational like video or resource, it might have a resource for you, so you can go from there. Other than that, I'd say like reading as well. Like, there's a lot of books that talk about sport and like mental performance. They sell them like Indigo or like any bookstore. Like, I've started seeing them a bit more now, so which is nice.
That's awesome.
And I think the last one I'd say is more so on the mental health side. Like, there's many initiatives going around that, you know, do research in mental health. Like, I know for like the Canadian Center for Mental Health and Sport, they have like certain frameworks that they're developing for like mental performance, mental health in that area in like the Canadian context. And then, you know, in Canada, there's the Canadian Sports Psychology Association. And so they have resources there. They have a list of their members and professionals listed on their website. So, you know, you can read about them. And then if you want to further inquire with one of them, I think there's contact information on that website as well. So just depends like what you're wanting to get out of it. If you're just trying to like do some like little reading or viewing, you know, you could start there. But if you're wanting to get involved with like a mental performance coach or like a sports psychologist, then you can kind of seek out those people's like through the Canadian Sports Psychology Association. Or I guess there's different like bodies for different areas. So there's like an American body, a European body. So it just depends on like where you are.
Thank you so much for the thorough response there. I was on the fence as to whether to ask the question or not, but I'm so glad I did, because I think just about anyone who's wanting to add this into the routine, there's something there for them is the message here. And you've outlined the resources incredibly well. And I wish we weren't at this point, because I have so many further questions. Perhaps another episode at some point in the future. But Claudia, thank you so much for the insight that you've shared today. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I have no doubt it will be super valuable to our audience. So as I've been saying, we appreciate the ingredient you've contributed here to our capsule of science, and best of luck with the upcoming research and everything you're doing on the consultant side as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this ingredient of the capsule, we invite you to view our full formula at capslab.org. That is CAPSLAB.org. We appreciate your investment in building a healthier world.